I'm going to be talking mainly about the lost decade, lost in terms of a decade of austerity and in terms of the extent to which austerity led to the great Brexit disaster. And it's great to be talking to all you pro-Europeans. You know, we are an important group, and I'm quite sure that as time goes on, we will look back at the extent to which Remainers holding in there, holding on to the European ideal, will eventually bring us back considerably closer towards Europe. And I'm going to start off by looking back at a cabal of anti-Europeans who have become so powerful. In 2012, they wrote a book called Britannia Unchained. They were extremists. They were, in a sense, insurgent Tories. They were perhaps like sort of militant tendency of Tories. And they were for cutting spending, for shrinking the state, for stripping trade unions of even more rights. And particularly, they were passionately anti-European. And it is their strand of conservatism that in the end won the day. And now they have all blown in on the coattails of their successful Brexit campaign, and they're running the show. Today's business secretary, Kwasi Kwarteng. These are the authors of this book. Kwasi Kwarteng, Home Secretary Priti Patel, Foreign Secretary Liz Truss, Justice Secretary Dominic Raab. They wrote this book in which they called the British workers the greatest idlers in the world, as if the workers themselves were responsible for low productivity. And I might say as well, they're not the only ones on the bedside of Sajid Javid, our health secretary. He says he keeps the works of Ayn Rand, the rapidly right-wing American writer who wants everybody to stand on their own 2 feet. And if they don't have 2 feet and they need a hospital bed, well, if they can't pay for it, they won't get one. Very, very extreme thinkers, these. And I think looking back on Britannia Unchained, it still looks very extreme. And they're now, of course, the front runners and the key influencers for whoever replaces Johnson, which I think is probably a when, not an if. We don't know exactly when, but I still feel he'll probably be gone before too long. He came to power partly on the cleverness of his slogans. Talk of levelling up was a stroke of brilliance. But of course, it would require the absolute opposite of what all these people, including Boris Johnson, have always stood for. It would require massive redistribution of income and opportunity, which only an activist, essentially social democratic state could or would do. Instead, under them, the poor get poorer. In 2010, child poverty had risen very steeply in the wake of cuts to benefits of 37 billion a year, taken almost entirely from families with children and from disabled people. And that left many more vulnerable people when lockdown came. Poverty is rising sharply now, according to both the Resolution Foundation and the Institute for Fiscal Studies. I mean, real levelling up would require enormous investment in the future. In schools, pupils are still per head getting 9% less spent on them than in 2010. Apprenticeships have been falling fast, despite the amount of talk you hear about them, many fewer. Further education, where half of all students are educated, has been cut radically. Early years decimated, particularly with the tragic loss of the whole Sure Start system, family hubs for all families. Now, our book, which you kindly just showed, here it is, The Lost Decade, chronicles the state of the country as it was, as it turns out, not that we knew it at the time, on the eve of COVID. In fact, our book came out about a week before the first lockdown. You're probably the last official allowed launch party for our book. And after 10 years of government, aided and abetted for a while by the Liberal Democrats, public services have been left threadbare, and what was an already profoundly unequal country was bound to suffer the effects of COVID unequally. I mean, like Brexit, the lost decade was built on lies, biggest of which was the need for austerity and for all these cuts. Capitalism all but toppled over in 2008 because of deregulation, greed, and the financialisation of the economy, and Labour deserved some blame for failing to rein in the city's excesses in its time of power. However, Cameron and Osborne very cleverly seized their chance, echoing what they had to say, of course, as ever echoed by their great claque, powerful claque in this country. 80% of our written press, which is Tory-owned, Telegraph, Times, Sun, Daily Mail, and others, fomented that deliberate lie that it was excessive state spending that was to blame, as if somehow miraculously the British public spending had managed to crash the world economy. The UK, Osborne said, had maxed out its credit card, which is a cunning analogy. Unfortunately, the public either bought or believed, just as they had Thatcher's similar comparison of the economy with her handbag, household budget. Here's the difference: households can't borrow to invest, but the state can. Cuts, they said, were the only way out of the crisis, and here was their chance to shrink the size of the state, which they did to a great degree. Let's start with some of the things they did. A local government has been enormously harmed. I think the May elections may reflect people's sense of what has happened. They were thrown into the front line of defence against the pandemic, but by then they were grossly underfunded, ill-equipped. And looking at a recent report of the National Audit Office, unprepared for the pandemic. It was in 2010, just before the Conservatives came to power, that I heard about an about to become Tory minister boast of his plans to devolve the axe to local councils. And so they did, making councils take the strain and the blame for most of the cuts that came along. And even now you get strikes against councils, protests against councils, as if they were to blame for the fact that their coffers are empty. Their biggest task is social care. That costs the most. Britain is aging. Increasing numbers of families have older relatives. Many are frail, no relatives to turn to. Social care has deteriorated so rapidly that Age UK says 2,000 people a day are now turned down for any help at all, people who would have qualified for help back in 2010. Boris Johnson said on the steps of Number 10, "I have an oven-ready plan to solve social care." That was over 2 years ago, and the ready-made plan is nowhere to be seen. And the levy on using national insurance, starting in April, goes almost entirely to the NHS, as social care is effectively collapsing. All through the last decade, Tory ministers repeatedly claimed that they were increasing NHS funding, but the population was increasing too, and especially, of course, the vulnerable numbers of vulnerable elderly people. The demographics meant that there was far more pressure on the NHS. Meant the amount of money available for each person fell. So even though they managed to keep the total sum just up to close to 1% most of the time, in real terms, the NHS funding was falling. So that when COVID struck, the NHS was short of 100,000 doctors and nurses, and training places for both of them was one of the first things that were cut in Osborne's first budget. After 10 years, there are now 43% fewer district nurses. There's only one school nurse for every 10 schools, and that's at a time when eating disorders and anxieties among the young are rife. The number of GPs has shrunk quite dramatically. The debts have mounted in NHS trusts whose buildings deteriorated, and there's been a sharp drop in the number of beds across the country. Labour had succeeded in reducing the waiting lists to virtually zero by 2010, but by 2019, 4.1 million were already waiting for operations. So don't let anyone pretend that the current long waits are just due to COVID. For the first time in our lifetime, life expectancy fell in 2019 and infant mortality rose for 3 years in a row. I find that profoundly shocking. On the eve of the financial crisis, GDP per capita in the UK was only 6% lower than Germany's. I say only, it's still quite a lot lower than Germany's, but by 2019, that gap had risen to 12%. And that is due to austerity, which diminished the economy itself, and of course to Brexit, which is cutting another 4% from our GDP. Wages stagnated for a decade, good jobs were cut, inequalities grew. Migrants and Europe were very easy scapegoats in that atmosphere where people felt grudgingly that things were not going their way, even if they couldn't quite define what it was that was happening to them in their living standards. Feelings of resentment festered, and the cynical opportunists of the Leave campaign found a very fertile field for them to maneuver, a fertile field that they had tilled themselves with the harshness of their austerity years. So it's a bit of irony that those who are most responsible for the condition of the left behind towns in the north are the ones who reaped the political rewards of that neglect, with all this lavish levelling up promise that is never going to be fulfilled. And incidentally, the northern towns that voted Tory are receiving some pork barrel rewards from the Towns Fund, and they're by no means the poorest northern places, which are mostly inside northern cities, but northern cities vote Labour, so they didn't get the money. Britain's basic problems, which we identify in the lost decade, really haven't changed. Children are being neglected, literally and figuratively. Inspectors' report says children's services are crumbling. Mental health services for the young are a scandal, storing up, and these things store up problems for decades ahead. You may not feel them now, but we will feel them increasingly in social dysfunctions in the future. Meanwhile, more older people need more health and social care. The IFS and the Health Foundation calculate that just to stay steady on an even keel over the next 10 years, the NHS needs another 102 billion. Most programmes for social care arrive at another price tag of around 10 billion a year. Across the country, young people are struggling to get housed. They are first generation for a long time who are worse off than their parents were at their age and worse housed. The wealth of existing homeowners who are occupying undertaxed properties accentuates the intergenerational inequalities. Property prices for all of us lucky homeowners have risen by 10% in just the last year. The Queen's speech has proposed a planning free-for-all, weakening further the powers of local authorities to insist on social housing or sustainable developments. I think we won't see many of those. We wrote The Lost Decade in the same spirit which we produced quite a few of our earlier books, including The Verdict. I shall show you that one too. It is The Verdict, came out in 2010. And that's an analysis of Labour's achievements. We wanted to chronicle Labour's achievements and Labour's failures to try to give readers a sense of what governments actually do as it impacts on people's lives. So in all these books, both these books, they sort of bookends the decade 2010 and 2020. We've talked to people all around the country and we've used vignettes from all walks of life, all occupations, to ask people, how was it for you? And in The Lost Decade, we've been back to talk to some of the people that we talked to in 2010 and say, well, what happened to you in this decade? To make these things real, not just numbers and statistics. But we do look at the numbers, the solid evidence of what did and didn't change. In this age of disinformation, this kind of auditing is more necessary than ever, getting the facts down with their references, where they come from. Those who devised austerity, of course, have themselves prospered inordinately. We've seen Cameron's venality has been exposed in embarrassing texts and emails soliciting state aid for the shady Greensill financial scheme. George Osborne skips into the latest top highest paid financial job, and now he's even taken over the chair of the British Museum, whose budget he strove energetically to cut when he was Chancellor. But the Conservatives are no longer riding high in the polls. I think they're quite frightened by recent by-election results. It looks more plausible that we could refresh Westminster with a non-Tory administration. I mean, notice that phrasing. The prospect of a straight Tory Labour switch to power looks remote. The mountain is so huge to climb. No party has, it would require a bigger landslide for Labour than achieved in 1997. That doesn't rule out change if the progressive parties are willing to collaborate and put together anti-Tory coalitions. And voters look to the future. Brexit is not done. More damage is yet to come. More import regulations are hitting in July. They're going to be very damaging. We know already that Brexit is knocking 4% off GDP because it's the Office of Budget Responsibility that says so. And we've only got to look at, almost every day. If you read the right newspapers like the Financial Times, you find the stories about 35,000 pigs slaughtered and buried, wasted 200,000 more in the backlog, likely to suffer the same fate. Well, it's not their fate, but the fate of the farmers. 60% of pork is now imported. And that's just in one industry. You look at fishing, flowers, hauliers, building contractors, medical suppliers, wherever you look, or provision of carers. The damage that Brexit has done to one industry after another. You look at the mountainous documents, 100 pages long, that the hauliers now have to have in perfect condition as they pass through Dover, Calais or Belfast. Vast amounts of red tape. I must admit, I was kind of wryly amused to see the British Chambers of Commerce protesting vigorously the other day, saying 71% of their exporters are suffering badly. And that Brexit has been enormously harmful to them. Because I remember through all the years before, they used to run something called the burdens barometer. And the burdens that they listed was almost any tax or any regulation. And of course, huge amounts of regulations, they said, came from Brussels. It's always Brussels they demonized. And they were very anti-European. And now they've discovered, alas, the hard way, that those regulations, the regulations they've got now, the red tape they've got now, is infinitely worse than the way that belonging to Europe actually eased their businesses, eased their exports and their imports. So now we have the end of scientific collaboration with Horizon. I'm glad you've got a speaker talking about that tragedy of our children, grandchildren, no longer on the Erasmus scheme. Control hasn't been seized back. People feel more out of control than they did before. Keir Starmer talks about easing this crisis in terms of make Brexit work. And I think that's quite a clever slogan. We might talk about that a bit more in our discussion afterwards. I think that's quite effective. It doesn't require anyone to change their mind, but to think about what we should do next and how we should make life easier for our businesses, for ourselves. I think that what voters feel, particularly at the moment, is of course the cost of living crunch. It's going to get far worse in April, and an average household is going to see about 1,200 added to their bills, tax, energy, food prices. Bank of England set to be raising its lending rates again and again for anyone who's got debts or got a recent mortgage. Now, what if those older voters, who are usually such very consistent supporters of the Conservatives, start to worry about the gaps in healthcare, their decreasing chances of getting any help at home if they need it, if they become frail, let alone an affordable place in a care home. What lies ahead? Slow growth, high inequality, badly handled economic disruption, which will undermine well-being, intensify social divisions, intergenerational divisions too, create political problems with enduring effects. Now, all of that was said not by some left-winger, it comes from the CBI and from the survey they've had from their boardrooms. What else are we expecting? Climate change, flooding, coastal erosion, massive task of decarbonising the UK, which means huge shifts in how cars, lorries, other transports powered, how we cook our food, heat our homes. And markets are not going to solve any of that. Nothing in Britannia Unchained points in the direction of how we cope with those future problems. We should already be preparing for the next pandemic, says Sir Patrick Vallance. Very good article today in the FT by Martin Rees, the Astronomer Royal, warning of future perils, horizon scanning, being ready for future emergencies. And that's, from climate effects to indeed future pandemics and any other change, how we must not again allow ourselves to be so unprepared. Those we're going into another decade of austerity with further cuts, with more tax cuts being promised, more cuts to spending. We will be in an even more threadbare position to face any future emergencies that come our way. I think that what our book shows is just how much heavy lifting it's going to take just to return to the levels of service that we had in 2010, whether in schools or care or wherever you look, or the NHS, let alone where we need to be by 2030 and the population and the demographics that we shall have then. So maybe this, to be optimistic, to end a bit more optimistically, maybe we are just at this moment beginning to feel a turning of the tide. In the south of England, voters are being tempted by Greens and Liberal Democrats. I think it's a question of turning to people now and asking, now's the time to ask yourself, what do you value most? What's most important to you? If you ask people, they say all the same things. They say their family's health, security, education. They say pride in their environment, in their country, in beautiful parks, public buildings, leisure centres, sports grounds, museums, galleries, in our arts and thriving culture, pride in our national heritage being well preserved. And yes, that includes that national treasure, the BBC, as well. I put it like this. Mrs. Thatcher always used to say to people, you will always spend the pound in your pocket better than the state will. Well, I will say exactly the opposite. Nothing that you can buy in a shop or indeed online is ever worth the value of those precious things that we can only buy together collectively from our taxes as the price of civilization.